Welcome to episode 3 of Podcast with Aisha. In the last episode, I shared how I began working at the Social Security and Housing Finance Corporation, where I was immediately bombarded with curiosity and questions from my colleagues. In this episode, I'll talk about what happened next and some of the things I learned along the way. After starting the job at Social Security and Housing Finance Corporation, many colleagues began expressing interest in me, particularly in terms of romantic relationships. I realized I needed to create some distance and set boundaries, so I came up with a plan. I approached the managing director, MD, who knew a bit about me, my background, and especially about my dad. To give you a bit of context, I've always been a daddy's girl. My dad has been my biggest support system, and wherever I am, I talk about him and how much he means to me. He even came to the office once to meet the MD. This is something my dad always does for all his children. Whenever one of us starts at a new school or job, he makes a point to meet our teachers or bosses and kindly asks them to take care of us. So, the MD knew my dad and was familiar with how much my dad values me. One day, I told the MD that I wanted to start telling people that I was married. We both laughed about it, and he respected my decision. I explained that it was a way to deal with the unwanted attention I was getting, and he understood my reasoning. Next, I approached my father-in-law, who worked at Social Security as well, since it was important to inform him about my plan. People would obviously ask him questions if I claimed to be married. When I told him my plan, he was surprised and asked me why. I kept the details vague, saying I didn't want too much attention. He understood and agreed, although he did jokingly say, "I'm not going to lie to people." We laughed, and I reassured him that I just wanted to prevent anyone from surprising him with questions about my marriage. From then on, I started telling everyone I was married, hoping it would create a boundary. Unfortunately, that didn't work as well as I hoped. Some men still continued to express interest in me, despite my efforts to keep them at a distance. Now, as my 6-month probation period neared its end, tensions with some colleagues started to grow. I began to feel excluded. Whenever I entered the office, there was an uncomfortable silence, but as soon as I left, the talking and whispering would start. It became clear to me that many of them didn't want me there, and they kept reminding me that the employees who were on leave would soon return. They wanted me to leave so badly. One of the main reasons for this tension was that they believed I was in a relationship with the MD, and this was before Mahjong even started. Additionally, they saw me as a threat. Even though I didn't have many formal qualifications at the time, the only qualifications I had were a high school certificate, computer and IT certificates, banking and finance qualification, certified accounting technician's qualification, and at the time, I just started ACCA. Despite my limited qualifications, I was still perceived as a threat because even my supervisor at the time didn't have the same qualifications. They wanted me out. The work environment became very toxic for me. I confided in my dad, telling him about the situation, and he encouraged me to focus on why I took the job in the first place. He was right, but it wasn't easy to ignore the toxicity. Sometimes I'd find myself in the restroom crying, only to pull myself together and pretend everything was fine when I returned to the office. There were times I recorded their conversations just to try and cope with the constant negativity, and that affected me emotionally. Occasionally, someone would come to me and say, "Do you know what they are saying about you?" It took a toll on my mental health, and each morning, I dreaded going to work, unsure of how the day would unfold. The stress and anxiety were overwhelming. As for the head of finance, our relationship was another story, something I'll talk about in the next episode. Stay tuned for episode 4, and thank you for listening.